welcome. I'm sorry that even just for a moment here, you've lost the music. Jill was explaining to me this is really a nightclub venue. And Tony, in the next half hour, we're going to bring that spirit back to the New York Times Climate Hub. We're going to think about business, we're going to think about climate, but at a rocking tempo, because as you'll appreciate, we've just got half an hour. The idea of this session, both for people in the room and people who are joining us around the country and possibly internationally too online, is to have a check-in every day on what's happening at COP, what business is saying, but also what business is hearing and learning at COP. And so before we get into, and I bring Andy and James and Jill in, I wanted to start, Tony, with you. Tony Danker is the Director General of the CBI. I think, Tony, can we, before we sort of get into finance, I know it's a quote-unquote finance day, and there have been some mighty big announcements, it would just be useful to get a sense from you of, if you like, your theory of the case, what you think is happening at COP, what you've heard, and what expectations will be of business.
Yeah, well, for those of you not here, for those of you watching online, COP is a very difficult thing to comprehend, because you've got a leaders stage with big speeches, and then somewhere hidden around the corner are negotiators, and then in between you've got lots of fairs and stalls and discussion and debate. So it's quite hard to get what's really going on when you're here. But I was at a lunch yesterday with Al Gore, who I think put it brilliantly. He said, you know, everybody is looking for, is it going to be a Paris or is it going to be a Copenhagen? But most COPs aren't like that. But what they are a milestone in a long arc of history. And what is the milestone, or the story in the arc of this COP? It's number one, we're talking about how rather than whether. And number two, there are a lot of businesses around here. A lot of CEOs have come to COP, because actually we're starting to get serious about what the politicians are calling the trillions of business rather than the billions of government. So I think that's the COP that this is, and we'll see what levels of announcement and agreement and alignment we have by the end of it, and we'll talk about why, particularly on finance, that's important. But I think those two things are important to remember. It's about the how now, not the what. And it's also about business actually getting the job done, which is a challenge for us in business, but it's also the world saying, we can't do it without you.
So I think, by the way, that is going to be one of the big thematic discussion points. How much the public sector is now looking to the private sector to help answer this set of problems, and incidentally, how much the private sector is saying, well, only if you define the problems, create rules for the future markets. And I feel as though it will be a subject we'll talk about over the coming days. It feels as though today, and given that we've got just half an hour, so I was fiddling with my phone to make sure I've got the time, keep to time, not one of my greatest strengths, as you know, Tony. But it feels as though today we've got the perfect example of that. We've got the private sector, if you like, coming out and saying, here's the money, and then everyone's saying, well, where are the markets? And where are the rules that govern that market? So before I come, if I might, I mean, having Andy, James and Jill here, we have a chance to listen to an asset manager, to a banker, to someone who speaks for consumers. Can I start with you? What's your read of the intersection of government and finance today?
You know, it's very interesting. The investment banking sector, when it comes to money, they always talk about the sources and the uses, right? So you need to get sources of money and you need to deploy that money against something. So what Mark Carney has just done this morning is to turn around and say, okay, we think we've got about 130 trillion. So that's the sources. And he itemizes where it's coming from. Some folks here will be some of the sources. But he's saying, what are the uses? Where are we putting this money to work? And if we're going to put this money to work, then, hey, we just created green markets, which, as you say, need rules and disclosure and transparency and pricing and market regulation and incentives. And the truth is, I don't really think governments are there yet. So governments say, come on, private sector, put real money, make real disclosure. And I think Mark Carney has just gone, okay, we've got some money. And Rishi Sunak this morning, the UK Chancellor, has gone, okay, I think we now need to get serious about this stuff called disclosure and reporting and assessment. The risk is, by the way, that that's happening only in national borders rather than internationally, and this is going to be a global flow of capital. So I think that's the finance discussion. Of course, just to remind everybody listening and watching, there is, of course, the story of public finance, which is that £100 billion target of public money to help the developing world get on the journey. But we're talking mostly today about private finance. We think we have the money. What we lack are exactly what you said, the market mechanisms to put it to work.
So I'm going to ask Jill, James and Andy in different ways, if you like, to speak for the money. Right? Jill Jackson is the chief executive of the Big Exchange. She also knows what this place is like when it's a nightclub, so if you want to talk to her about, things that are possibly even more exciting than 130 trillion in financial commitments. James Close is the head of climate at NatWest, and so I'm going to ask you, James, about the banking side of this. And Andy Briggs, many people will know, is the chief executive of Phoenix, of the Phoenix Group. Andy, can I start with you? Because if you look at, if you like, Mark Carney's cake, that 130, 135 trillion in potential finance, asset management is the biggest slice of it. Will you just pick up where Tony left off? How much of that money is real? How much of that money is accessible now?
Yeah, so if I, let me boil down to the money and then what we need. So from the money perspective, if I bring it down to the UK, in the UK, we estimate we need £2.7 trillion over the next 15 years to deliver on the journey to net zero in the UK. The savings and retirement sector, insurance sector, can do a third of that, so £0.9 trillion. So that's 60 billion a year. So just to give you a real life example, at Phoenix Group, we're the UK's largest long-term savings and retirement business. We invest £300 billion on behalf of 13 million customers. Last year, we invested about £1 billion into sustainable investments, new lending to sustainable investments. We'll double that this year to £2 billion. But our sort of share of the 60 billion is about 8. So we're making good progress, we're doing good stuff, but we need, if we doubled this year to 2, we kind of need to get up to about 8 billion is our share of it. And we've got lots of real life examples. So for example, earlier this year, we invested £170 million in a range of sustainable energy projects, so combination of solar, hydro, wind, across the 4 nations of the UK. So we've got lots of examples of good things we're doing. We just need more projects. And what we basically need is a very stable investment environment that government needs to help create, so that because we can't invest our customers' money unless it's going to generate a reliable, steady return for them. We have that fiduciary responsibility. So we need that steady investment environment. And then secondly, we do need a public-private sector partnership on this. So we can do the heavy lifting of this with the billions and trillions that the world, the financial sector can invest. But we do need some of the kind of equity element, the risk element, to be taken by government up front. And so, because we can't put our customers' money into that when it's so uncertain. So that's basically the key to unlocking this.
Can I just ask, Andy, anyone of a slightly sceptical disposition would worry about the pace of change that's being asked in terms of investment? And I think they would worry about 3 things. One is, and we've seen a little bit in the DWS case in Germany in terms of financial allocation against supposedly green investments that then didn't turn out to be green. So it'll be like, are the assets that you're investing in really as green as they claim? Then there'll be investors who say, well, I bet you they are green, but as you say, I'm not sure they're going to deliver a return. They're unsafe. And then the third is whether or not actually, although the money is notionally there, we haven't yet seen it. We haven't seen that exponential increase in terms of new financial commitments, and there may be a ceiling that we haven't yet discovered. So will you just address those things from an asset manager's point of view?
So that there's a huge desire from our customers to invest sustainably. So when we survey our customers, 85% of our 13 million customers expect us to be investing their money sustainably, even if the fund they're investing in doesn't have a sustainability label on it. So there's a real desire for customers here. So in the context of our 300 billion of investments, doing 8 billion a year is not an issue. Yeah, it absolutely can be done with the right projects and opportunities. I mean, the other key point though is it is really critical that we establish global standards of science-based targets, so that the reporting, that the claims people make can be validated. If you look globally at large corporates, globally only 20% of large corporates have committed to net zero. But if you look at that 20%, only a quarter of them have committed in a way that actually withstands scrutiny in terms of science-based targets and the rigor. So that international kind of standards of data and measurement is really fundamental as well.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit, and I'm going to come back to you, Tony, on this, and sort of reputational risk for business, because I think coming out of COP, there's going to be a whole load of holding business to account on a new set of commitments, and lots of business can hold it. But I'd love to hear a little bit about banks, because I suppose, James, there are a number of questions here, but the first one is the role of debt and how much of this change can feasibly be funded by bank debts.
Well, I think, and to tie that into your previous question, which is what's the pace that this trajectory is moving at? So we set a target for 20 billion of climate finance and sustainable funding 3 years ago, and we achieved it in 18 months. So we've set another target of 100 billion pounds by the end of 2025. So you can see how we're scaling up the lending and the financing that we're provided through capital markets. I think the lending point is really interesting, because that goes back to Andy's point about needing the right environment to make sure that debt is viable debt. I mean, we don't want to be writing that off because it's going to projects that don't work. So we have to align it with the transitions that's taking place in the real economy. And that's why we need to give our customers, who are the ones who are going to make this transition happen, the tools that enables them to measure their impact today and how they're going to reduce it over time.
And James, what do you make, I suppose, Andy was sort of saying nicely, the question is, are there going to be enough investable projects? And I'm sure, climate activists, the public, go, what are you talking about? We can see everywhere what needs to be done. What's the difference with a problem that needs to be solved and an investable project that can solve it?
Well, I think two things. One, the net zero by 2050 gives us a very clear direction of travel, particularly for long-term infrastructure-related projects, because they take 30 years and they have a long life associated with them. So knowing where that destination is means that we can package those structural financing agreements in a way that gets that money moving. I think the other thing I would say is there is a huge business opportunity for small and medium-sized enterprises. And we did our Springboard to Sustainable Recovery report, $160 billion pounds of revenue opportunity, 130,000 jobs. And we want to get that money into the hands of small businesses so they can become greener and more sustainable and take advantage of that opportunity that's opening up.
And what do you say to people who are worried about banks in particular now having to take a dual role? We, the banks, are going to be the ones that lend you the money, that enable your new business idea, transformational technologies. At the same time, we, the banks, are increasingly required to oversee your business's transition, your business's net zero. And so the business of the banks has become both enabling and policing of big and small companies. How do you take that on?
Well, I think that's the way finance works. It prices risk. And we're taking a different view of risk because we're seeing the trajectory of the economy shifting. And that means that we're looking at greener and more climate smart projects as being lower risk. So that incentivizes the lending and reduces the cost of capital and enables that money to go to those types of projects.
Well, Andy, I'm going to come back to you. I just want to hear from Jill, and now I want to make sure we hear from everyone and then get into it and some of the discussions and kind of commentary that's already been today. Jill, I suppose it tells you a little bit about the way in which the world of finance works. We talk to the asset managers, we talk to the bankers, and then we say, now, what about the people? What about customer power in this? From Big Exchange's point of view, how much do you think consumers really have the power in this financial transition that we like to think we have?
Yeah, I definitely think increasingly consumer power is coming to the forefront in this area. We've seen at the Big Exchange 40% of our customers have never invested before, and the reason that they've been driven to invest is that they understand that they can use their savings to help fund this transition and help fund getting us to the point that they can look their kids in the eyes and say, I did everything I could to make this happen. I think the point that you made earlier about the danger of companies saying they're doing one thing but doing another is critical for consumer confidence, and that for everybody on this panel, the consistency of the choices that financial organisations make will determine how many consumers choose to invest in this way. And it's not enough to say, we're doing all these stinky bad things over here, but we've done this one really good thing over here. That's not going to work well for consumers anymore at all.
And equally, Jill, though, I always wonder, because there's a lot of criticism about companies that say one thing and do another. I'm not so sure that we individually are so different in that.
Yeah.
I wonder to myself, if you have a, if you like, more ethical net zero fund that you can invest in, that's going to deliver a lower return over time, and I know people would love to tell you that, you know, you can do better financially by doing well, it's still a little unproven that. What's your experience of what customer behavior is when the returns are higher with funds that don't necessarily deliver as great an outcome in terms of emissions and climate?
I think that that's a real challenging one, and I think the data is increasingly supporting that investing in this way actually in the long term provides a better financial return, and you can only look at the regulation that's happening to traditional industries that have provided that steady income that Andy was talking about there. They're becoming under increased scrutiny that will impact the level of steady income they can produce for companies like Phoenix and their customers. So I think that there's a huge opportunity for business to be able to demonstrate that these returns can be supported by investing in this way. But I also think that consumers are way more understanding than that. I think that consumers now understand that long-term goal, and a lot of the discussion around getting to net zero by 2030 really helps with that long-term investment horizon for consumers, whereas previously investing wasn't really regarded like that. And I'm sure Andy can speak to the fact that a huge amount of people are not engaged in their pensions, not engaged in their money, but the subject matter of the future of the planet engages them in their finances and gives us all an opportunity to help people do better financially, but also help with social inequality as well, because a lot of people don't invest. And increasingly in the UK, we're all being held accountable for our financial future. There's less government support. So it does more than just deliver a return and an impact for the planet. It helps reduce social inequality, particularly in the UK.
It feels as though there are a huge set of really big practical issues, which I'd like to come to. I just want to talk about the reputational thing that Jill just touched on. Because it does feel, even today, even, you know, the announcement comes out, the GFAN's announcement comes out, and you can see, you know, the news cycle and the way it works is that already there's a lot of noise about, is the money real? Are the people who are making commitments telling, quote unquote, the truth? Tony, firstly from a CBI point of view, and then James, I want to ask you from the banking sector point of view, how do you read that? How do you convince people, and how much do you worry about people losing confidence that the announcements have got way ahead of the real world events?
Well, look, let me give you the kind of barometer that people like me care about, which is COP is filled with chief executives. That was not true in previous years, right? If you're in the greenwashing business, right, you don't send your chief executive along, right? If you're in the investment business, if you're in the growth business, if you're in the genuine opportunity business, you see a room full of chief executives. And the chief executives are in town. And I just think we have crossed the Rubicon of, you know, that sort of the greenwashing age in terms of mindset of the leaders of major companies. However,
can I just say one thing,
yeah.
just to be clear?
Go on.
There are, I think, a bunch of people on the climate activism side who feel passionately the opposite, that the thing they worry about when it comes to the arrival of suits is not that everyone here is disingenuous, right? It's that they genuinely, right, are here trying to make the change, and that's why the CEOs come, not just for business opportunity, they genuinely want to make the change. But they're not the mechanisms, they're not the systems, they're not the marketplaces for it to happen. So if you like, the whole choir is singing the same song, but they're not the means of actually delivering what's required.
Understood. So I think, look...
It's a kind of greenwashing 2.0.
No, I understood. But I think that's why, you know, today of all days, this idea of the mechanisms around disclosure, the evidence points, the proof points. I did a great panel yesterday with the global head of EY. And he said, you know, accountants in the future are going to have to learn not just to count pounds and dollars, but to count carbon.
Yeah.
And that is where we move to next. And businesses like the three here will have no fears about accountability. And I think we need to go through that world of accountability to really learn the truth about who's investing, how much and why. I think that will tell us why investment is worthwhile. And who's not investing. So, you know, to use a phrase you'll know as a journalist, you know, sunshine is the best form of disinfectant. We will work out who's investing and who isn't. And if people aren't investing, why not? Is it because they're not serious? Are the climate activists right? Or is it because, to your earlier question, actually it raises big questions for government about we don't have the projects and we don't have the markets. And so we were blame shifting as to whether or not this was government's job or business's job. But actually, now that we see the data, now that we have the transparency, we can see who's investing, who's winning. We can see who's not investing and why, and we can start to ask the kinds of questions that you're asking.
So can we, I'd love Andy, James and Jill to get your view on exactly that accountability, right? So starting with the consumer, Jill, how do you get a really simple, accessible metric on which banks, which fund managers are doing what they say they're doing and which projects are investable? How do you make that digestible for the consumer?
I mean, that's a really good question, and it's something that we really concentrated on when we were building our business, about how do we take 50 different funds and assess them to prove that they're actually doing what they say they're doing. And we developed our own methodology for that, but one of the key drivers for it, every single time we asked a fund manager why that, so they gave us a list of all the companies they held. The question is, why did you pick that company to invest in? What about that company makes you believe that it's sustainable, making a real change? So it's not just about data, and I think the reality for us, we're all looking for this global standards, data-led solution. And yes, we need that, but the qualitative information around companies is also important, and that's way harder to industrialise. And that's something that we've been able to do on our scale, but I think to do it on a much broader scale, we need some technologies to improve that, because the big elephant in the room here is that financial companies need to get better about being transparent with consumers about everything they do, not just shine a light on the things that they want to shine a light on. And I think that'll drive change as well from a consumer point of view, because if somebody knows that their pension money's only invested in oil and tobacco, they're likely to make a change on that.
Well, James, you could say that's already come up today, hasn't it? People are already asking the question, well, if you say it's X, how do we know? So I appreciate the banks will kind of, if you like, analyse the risk of the things that they invest in or lend to, but how do we as society analyse what banks are saying versus what they're doing?
Well, I think, carbon is a new currency, isn't it? I mean, we set our amount of carbon we've got on our balance sheet today. It will be messy, it will be inaccurate, and we've got to work out how we're reducing it over time. And we will allocate our capital in a way that enables us to achieve our carbon objectives. So we're now optimizing our balance sheet for an extra factor, and we'll have to build that in, and we'll report on it. And as Tony says, that will bring disclosure risk. And when I sit with my colleagues who are looking after the Executive Disclosures Committee, they won't let us put things out that we can't stand up. And, this is big issues around reputational risk. So I think the system will work. I think it'll hold firm, and I think that's really important.
Can I just ask you, Andy, a question about the system in a different regard, which is around ESG, right? And it takes the same point Tony made about accountability. I was in a conversation yesterday with Theodor Weimer, who's the head of Deutsche Börse, and he says, look, there's not a system around ESG. In fact, there are two big competing systems. There's, if you like, the sort of European mindset, which says, let's create a taxonomy, let's create a set of rules and then standards that are all agreed. And there's a sort of US market system, which is that the markets, financial instruments, will price risk. And the result at the moment feels like a huge confusion around ESG. What can you trust, what can't you? From Phoenix's point of view, what would you like to see happen?
We do need to get to a kind of single, accepted, science-based, common global view, basically, and that's essential so that we take this question of greenwashing and inaccurate data off the table, and everyone's held to account in a consistent way. And I'm with James on this. That's absolutely doable. We've done it with accounting standards. You have accounting standards that have consistency of the way companies report their finances and balance sheet. We can do the same here, and it needs to be done at a global level, and that's one of the things that needs to emerge from this COP. I mean, if I can, I wouldn't mind, because I do think the bigger, I think that's all manageable. The bigger issue we need to get right is how do we get the right projects set up in the right way? And if I can just give a couple of examples, offshore wind in the UK has been a huge success story. The government created a very stable market environment, and we've seen the cost per megawatt hour drop from £150 to £40, substantial capital flowing. That's a great example. If I take the biggest single emitter in the UK is transport. I would love to have an electric car. I live in a townhouse in central London on a busy road where there's no parking outside. If I walk round the block a couple of times of an evening, I can't see spare charging points. I can't have a car I can't use, yeah? So what we need to get is infrastructure of charging points that's suitable. We then need to get the manufacturing capability right, but we also going to need some regulation to make the consumer affordability of electric cars versus diesel cars work. So that's a great example where you need the car manufacturers, you need government, you need funding providers like ourselves, all to come together and work out what's the route map here to actually bring that about in practice and make it happen. And that for me is that's what we need to do for each of the major things that need to be done.
Tony.
I'm going to make a partisan pro-business point, if I may, right?
From the Director General of the CBI.
Turns out, look what happens when you get business round the table to go at this problem, right? First few days of this summit have been, 2070, 2060, maybe, can't even get close on carbon pricing. Governments struggle to find a framework. Here we are, right? We're going through the accountability framework. We want it. Let's get it done. Should it be that standard or that standard? Should be like accounting. When's that going to happen? Where are the projects? Where can I fund them? Have you got any in transport? I think the cadence, the metabolic rate of change, once you get the private sector to, yes, be held accountable, but also look to deploy funds and to look to deliver on the strategies that are being put forward, I think you're going to see altogether more exacting questions. And I don't think the reputational harm is going to be on business. I think business are going to start asking questions that I sometimes say, we need announcements that aren't dispatch box ready. We need announcements that are boardroom ready.
But Tony, can I just say one thing? I think I buy all of that, but I think there's a lot of pressure on you. Because in this context, what will happen is, this is what Andy just said. He actually set out a set of markets that need to be created by government.
Yep.
Right? And you worked in the Treasury.
Yep.
Right? The Treasury, I think, and to a certain extent BEIS, can help shape and reshape markets that already exist. We're talking about the actual creation of new markets.
Yep.
And I just don't know whether or not when you go into number 11 or you go into BEIS, you think, okay, these teams have really figured out what's required to create those.
I think you're right. Look, I think that's exactly right. I think that's next year's question, right? We'll finish the year feeling good, I hope, about a COP26 outcome. We've had Prince Charles, the Prime Minister, John Kerry. The private sector is going to get the job done. And we're all going to turn around and go, okay, get it. Now we're going to need this, and this. And we're going to need exactly the kind of capability you describe within the public sector, within governments. How do we genuinely make markets? How do we make markets work? And I think you're right. I don't think we've switched on to that, but I think that is the question.
But but honestly, for example, within Treasury, do you think they have that mindset? Do you think they realise, what, frankly, people like Andy just described, which is we're all on board, but you're going to have to create incentives and rules for those markets?
Look, I think they're taking small steps, and we need giant leaps, right? So how do you get markets going, right? You pump prime, look at the offshore wind story, right? You pump prime them, and fair play to the government, with heat pumps, they've realised the idea that you need to pump prime a market, right? How do you incentivise them, right? How does the tax system reward those that invest in green and disincentivise those that don't? You need to think about market mechanisms, exactly like we had in offshore wind. We don't yet have those on hydrogen. We have the promise of them. So look, I think they get it. I think they're on the beginning of the journey. But, once you get the private sector involved and you get $130 trillion that wants to go somewhere, I think the pace of expectation about how quickly we make these decisions goes up rapidly.
Right. Well, another thing for 2022 is I'm going to have to get a watch, so it doesn't look as though I'm looking at TikTok in the middle of our conversation. But I am aware of the fact that our thinking with these conversations is they're half an hour, they're a check-in on the subject of the day. They're going to be happening throughout COP. So there's much more that we're going to be discussing over the next week, 10 days. We're going to say a big thank you to Andy Briggs, to James Close, to Jill Jackson. It's really been fascinating and very good to see you as ever, Tony. Thanks very much, everyone, joining us online. Thank you in the room. See you tomorrow.